Shabbat Shalom. Long time ago, or 40-some years, I guess, at this point, my grandmother, may she rest in peace, had a beautiful home in San Diego, which is where I grew up. And her particular piece of property was very special, especially in San Diego, because it had an artesian well. It actually was tapped into one of the deep springs in that part of the city, county, and that meant that there was water just freely bubbling up from that spot in the ground. That is very rare in San Diego. In Florida, it's too much of a problem. There, it was very rare, and that meant her garden was incredibly lush. There was a little stream that went down that fed a bunch of other gardens down the street, and she even had a beautiful little pond. Now, I don't know how it happens in San Diego, but somehow you still get all those little critters that need to have that kind of environment, even though there isn't another little pond or stream anywhere within miles, but they're there. And as a boy, I'll tell you, crawdads are a lot of fun. If you've never played around with crawdads, or crayfish, as they're sometimes called, then you don't know how much fun they are, because they sit there, they're like little lobsters, and you can learn how to catch them. Now, the secret to catching crawdads is liver. Liver and being slow. You see, there's two things that have to remember when you're catching a crawdad. One is that they have these big old claws, and when you want them to chomp into the liver, and the liver is so springy, they can't get their claws. And that way, when you pick them up on the string, they'll come with you, because otherwise they would release and get away. And the reason you've got to be slow is because where crawdads live is incredibly muddy. It is perfectly clear when you first look down. You can see them all scattered around the bottom of that pond. But as soon as one of them runs with a flick of its tail that shoots them off, there is a cloud of mud that goes up, and now you can't see anything, and you have to sit there waiting for all of it to die down again, and then you can see where they're hiding, and you can slowly drop your liver in and try and catch the next one. Everybody got the picture? I will say that it's been a long time since I've eaten a crawdad, because eventually I did start keeping kosher. They weren't all they were cracked up to be anyway. And it's a lot of work for a very little amount of food. Now, why am I telling you about crawdads? Well, because we are in Bereishit, Bereishit. And it's not just about the swarming things, of which they are a category. It's because the whole story of creation, well, people talk about it while they're looking through the mud cloud of 1,000 different crawdads over the last 500 years flicking their tails. And nobody's actually seen through it clearly to understand what the text is trying to tell us. So let me explain first the human crawdads that we got to deal with, and then maybe we'll be able to let the mud settle, and we'll be able to see clearly what the story of Bereishit, Maaseh Bereishit, is trying to tell us. So first of all, where did all these crawdads come from that we have to deal with before we can even enter into the discussion of creation? Why is there all this mud around this topic? Well, essentially it's because people are, well, some people are authoritarian by nature. They are reactionary by nature. In the ancient past, this was not such an issue, partly because of the way social structures worked at the time. But essentially, in European culture, essentially since the time of the Reformation and onwards, what we would call the modern era. I know it's a few hundred years ago, but trust me, this counts as modern by most historical accounts. There has been a crisis within European culture, and religion has been the weapon of choice when dealing with that crisis, even though it's not religion that caused the crisis in the first place. That is to say, the underlying crisis is one of who's really in charge. The Protestant Reformation came along and said the Catholic Church should not be in charge. They've been in charge for 1,500 years. We disagree with the Catholic Church. Therefore, they should not be in charge. And the Catholic Church went, wait a minute. We're not going to let go that easily. In fact, we are going to take your challenge to our authority as indicative of a general ideology challenging authority, and therefore we will slam on our brakes against any potential threat that we get a whiff of that we think will challenge our authority. So someone starts dropping lead weights off of the Tower of Pisa. We're going to call him down and say, Galileo, no, you can't be doing that. You can't be telling us that there are mountains on the moon, because we have decided there aren't, and therefore your scientific investigation is not blasphemy per se, but more importantly, a challenge to our authority. If people can just go out and figure things out on their own, then what happens to our power? What happens to our authority? Therefore, we will dictate how to read creation. We will dictate what must be believed. Inquiry will be stomped on. It will be removed. Very big crawdad making a lot of mud over all of this conversation. But you might be thinking, but wait, Rabbi, what about the Protestants? The Protestants, after all, were reforming Christianity. They were pushing back against the Catholic Church. That began the Counter-Reformation, the reactionary mindset within the Catholic Church, which up until that point had been slightly more agreeable towards scientific inquiry, but then began to slow down. What about the Protestants? Well, they must surely be very open to all of the modern science. No. Unfortunately, at the same time that Catholicism was digging in its heels, Protestantism was going through two different issues. One, it was trying to establish its own authority. Having broken away from the Catholic Church, it kind of set the precedent that if you didn't like what your church was doing, you could break away from it too. And so Protestantism, rather than staying just entirely under the dominion of Martin Luther, was suddenly fracturing into hundreds of different denominations, and they didn't like that any more than the Catholics liked it. And so they wanted to exert their authority of interpretive doctrine as well. And Protestantism had a second layer which made it even more likely to kick up mud when it comes to understanding the actual text. And that was they believed they understood the text. What do I mean by that? Protestantism in particular had as one of their cardinal points that every person could interpret the text naturally and easily on their own, because Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, would guide their reading. That if you opened up the Bible and you read it in good faith, whatever occurred to you that it meant must be what God wanted it to mean. That you would be guided in your own personal studies. You didn't need the priest to explain it to you. You didn't need someone else to explain it. Your own personal reading would tell you what it meant. And you couldn't be wrong as long as you were faithful, which means if someone said you were wrong, it meant you must not be faithful. And that means I'm going to fight for my interpretation, because saying that my interpretation is wrong is the equivalent of saying I'm a sinner. So therefore, whatever occurred to me must be true. Very, very dangerous idea, and one that we are still dealing with as a pernicious problem within the modern world, a contemporary world. But this meant that for the vast majority of people who would open up the Bible and start reading from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, they would read it secure in the knowledge that their reading was perfectly right, even if they weren't very clever, even if they were as dumb as a post. But they couldn't be wrong because they had faith. So when they read the book of Genesis, and the book of Genesis said, on day one, God made light and dark, they imagined, guided by the Holy Spirit, of course, that this was a literal 24-hour day, and that God somehow had a giant factory that he was cranking out creations with on each day. And on one day it was light and dark, on one day it was the heaven and the earth, and it looked just like things looked on their farm, or in the factory that they worked in, or in their kitchen. They would use metaphors within their own frame of reference, and this was what they imagined. So they kicked up a whole lot of mud. So now, when anyone says, let's talk about the story of creation, the pond is a mess. Because all of these ideologies, which have nothing to do with the actual meaning of the text, are shooting back and forth like dirty little crawdads, kicking up so much dirt that those of us who actually want to study it have to first give the first half of a sermon to explain why that is all pointless and unnecessary. Everybody who's like, oh, science versus religion, and oh, young earth creationists, and Satan hid fossils to trick us, and all. Ugh, mud. Mud. And such a nuisance for those of us who don't have a dog in that fight. Because all of those fights, like I said, are about who's in charge of those communities, who gets to pick and choose who to order around. And honestly, we're not going to let them order us around, and we're not going to buy into their ideology anyway, so we need to learn how to tune that out. The most interesting question when we open up the story of creation is not, where are the dinosaurs? The most interesting question is not, what happened to Neanderthal? Those are all questions that have been perpetrated by the crawdads of history rather than the text itself, by people who have sought to make their mark on the world and on each other through their violent arguments over the text itself without actually bothering to understand the text itself. So, let the dust settle. We're not talking science religion here. We're not talking young earth creationist, old earth creationist, all of that stuff, right? All of that stuff is nonsense. Let the pond go clear. What are we meant to learn from the parashah we just read? From these first few little days, little verses, one chapter, what are we meant to learn? Why did God bother? One word at a time works better. Why did God bother appending this to the front of our Torah? What is it trying to tell us? And the hint, it's not trying to tell us what got made on each day, because that is irrelevant. How does your life change if light and dark gets made on day 1 as opposed to day 2? Does that change your life? Does that change the way you're going to live? Does the morality of your existence fundamentally shift if birds were created before fish or fish were created before birds? Is that that's why God gave it to us? Or God just put it there because he thought it might be neat, that we'd be interested to know what his weekly planner said for 1 week? And that was why God wasted text within the Torah, which is of a premium. The Torah is not a long book. When God includes something there, it is more than just to satisfy our idle curiosity of what the universe looked like at the beginning of time. Now, it is a little hard to talk about this topic in Judaism, not just because of the crawdads, but because historically, we weren't allowed to. Yeah, I know, you've heard me say 1,000 times, Judaism loves questions, Judaism loves questions, and that's true. But there are 3 topics that Judaism has been very reluctant to do large discussions about. Privately, yes. Issues regarding certain intimate topics, we tend to be more discreet rather than giving full lecture hall type discussions. Mystical topics, such as the chariot of Ezekiel, also very, very restricted and limited in order to make sure that the student is getting the right idea from what this discussion is about. And Ma'aseh Bereishit, the story of creation, was another that was very limited on how it was discussed. Now again, we can tell from this that Judaism already knew this was not about God's daily planner. Because why would we need to be careful on how we discussed God's to-do list? What possible implication? Mysticism, I know, people can go crazy. And intimacy, I know, people are kind of strange around those topics. But creation? I can read the order of the 10 plagues. Why can't I read the order of the discussion of creation and have it explained to me in deep detail? Well, because we did have a legitimate concern that for many people, the deep details of creation, as we understand it, might not work well with their level of faith wherever they currently were within the growth of their faith as a person. That there are certain elements to the Jewish deep understanding of creation that can shake people. Now, for about the last 1,000 years, we've stopped worrying about that as much. Rambam kind of spilled the beans, and lots of other people went along with him and even made it louder of what we were trying to not say too loud, because it turns out that people were beginning to ask more and more questions that needed the answers that are there within the deep discussion of creation. So we're going to do the very, very, very brief version, and I will assume any burden before the throne of God for having disclosed the secrets within my community, but I think people need to hear it because so much of the general discussion of creation has been dominated by the crawdads that you all deserve to see what a clean pond looked like. So the fundamental truth of creation that was reserved only for when people were properly prepared to hear it is that there were no 6 days of creation. That the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 model was not ever meant to be understood literally because, in fact, God created all of it instantly. That there wasn't a 1-day, 2-day, 3-day cycle. There was instead creation. And that was it. And once creation had been set in motion and God was resting, Shabbat, well, that was the story of reality. God was no longer tinkering with the rules of nature. God was no longer readjusting this, that, or the other. He had got everything in place and then said, go. Push the button and creation went off. Now for us in the modern world, that's not so radical because we've all grown up with the theory of the Big Bang and the idea that all of creation would begin at a single instant and everything that would be unfolding from that, all the laws of nature and all the laws of reality would come out of that process. We've all gotten that since we were little kids. So we're in a slightly better place to internalize this concept. But in the ancient world, that was rather radical because what did it mean that everything was just created at once? Why would we need to believe that? And doesn't that diminish my belief of God's ongoing presence in the world? Wouldn't I then lose faith of God still being around? Doesn't that drift towards the philosophical ideas of the Greeks that the true prime mover is removed from the world? Now, they're great questions, and Judaism does respond by saying, nope, God has not disappeared. God is still present in the world. God is still involved in the world. It's just that God isn't rewriting the rules of nature constantly for the world, but is instead merely guiding the world through the agents of ourselves and the forces that God already put in place. But that gets a little more complicated, and we'll hold off on that second level unless you want to join me for get lunch. But the underlying truth here is that when the Torah tells us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it is not trying to tell us what God did, it's trying to tell us why God did. To just tell us that the universe was created in a giant blinding flash of God's will is great and wonderful and very deep, and there's a lot that we can gain from that. But the story as laid out in the book of Bereishit doesn't tell us that version, precisely because it's not there to tell us, for our idle curiosity, what everything looked like at the beginning. It is instead trying to tell us what the purpose of creation was in the first place. And the purpose of creation, as laid out through the narrative of this first chapter of Bereishit, is to turn chaos into order through the input of effort. And God sets that out by showing you begin with tohu vavohu, this chaotic void at the beginning, which was the first thing created, and then each day of creation becomes increasingly complex and increasingly ordered. Just light and dark is a very beginning, very basic form of order, a simple differentiation, one that we continue to comment on when we have Havdalah. But then each successive day continues to up the level of complexity and the level of order, the level of structure that the universe is now being filled with. Now, it's easier to tell that story if you break it into stages and you go 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, than to do it in the more journalistic account of a blinding flash of God's will, which summoned the entire universe into existence in its totality. Because when you say totality, you don't get the granularity that shows you the point of the universe is to take that chaos and turn it into order. But there is a problem. Well, not a problem, but there is something that needs to be discussed through that story that gets overlooked. Well, if the whole purpose of the universe is to take that chaos and turn it into order, Well, first of all, why didn't God just make perfect order in the first place? But more importantly, if God set the whole notion of the universe, the laws of reality into order, then why does it seem like the universe actually is constantly unraveling? One of the most consistent laws within the universe is what's called entropy, that given enough time, things break down. And this seems to be a physical truth of God's reality. So if the universe is constantly breaking down, and if God has ceased, he has had his Shabbat and is no longer tinkering with the laws of reality, then how are we meant to create greater order? How is that going to materialize? And the answer, of course, is that's your job. Welcome, humanity. It's not your job to make planets, and it's not your job to make birds and all of those things. Those have been put in place. But it's your job to be in charge of them and to expend your effort in order to create a more beautiful version of what we currently have. When it talks about us ruling over nature, which again is another thing crawdads have made too much of a mess of, with the idea that that means we can exploit the natural resources to our heart's content. When it's talking about that, what it's saying is use the universe that I have given you together with the morality that I will teach you and transform this from a more chaotic, disharmonious, painful, suffering place into one of beauty and wonder where we can live to that fullest expression of the human soul. And that is explained a little bit more clearly, at least if you can ignore the crawdads, by doing a day 1, day 2, day 3 cycle, showing everything being set up, leading towards humanity being conscious, being aware, being sentient enough to be able to embark upon this spiritual quest that ensures that the latent properties of justice and peace and kindness and all of that's good will fully be realized within the universe. That we will be the instrument that fights back against the constant entropy, the constant pull, the constant tendency for things to degrade. And that makes effort. And a lot of people don't like to talk about our responsibilities. They want to say, oh, God, please save me. God, please fix this. God, do this. You know, oh, this is the way God wanted things to be, so that's the way it's going to be. What can I do about it? It's God's will. And Judaism comes along and says, no. God made the universe as a place where you would do things that matter. Get up off your tuchus and do the things that matter. Don't complain about it unless you're going to fix it. And don't expect someone else to fix it for you, least of all God, because it is in your hands. That's the reason you were made in the first place. That's the reason the whole story of your existence was explained as it was in the first place. Because God could have skipped all of these chapters and just gone straight to Abraham, and we would have had all the narrative of our people that we would have loved without an understanding of the fundamental purpose of it all. So as we go through these chapters, there's still much more that's been muddied in the stories of the Torah. Please, look past the dirt, look past the mud. Try to see the clear glass, the clear understanding of what God has wanted us to embrace. Next week, we're going to look into the story of Noah. Maybe second only to Genesis, as the story of Noah confounded and confused people purposefully for nefarious purposes. Instead, let's see if we can't find out something deeper from it. That's your homework. Shabbat Shalom.